Does gathering intelligence in the streets, restaurants, and mosques of New York City, is that a legitimate policing tool? Is the end of what was sometimes called the demographic unit forced by politics or simply a response to a program that wasn't working? That's the inside story. Joining us for an assessment of the NYPD program and the broader issues it raised in its decade of operation and raises now that it's gone, Linda Sarsour, Executive Director of the Arab American Association of New York, Sebastian Gorka, Professor at the Institute of World Politics, and Al Jazeera America legal contributor Jami Floyd. Linda Sarsour, let me start with you. You got what you wanted. You had complained about this program, but we also just heard Mayor Bloomberg and Commissioner Kelly, former Commissioner Kelly, making what sounded on their face as reasonable defenses of the program. Why did you feel it had to go?
The unit shouldn't have never been there in the first place, and as you stated in the opening setup, this unit never generated any leads. So for since 2003 up until 2012, we got no leads. It did not help us foil any plots. None of the information gathered was helpful in our counterterrorism efforts. And also, the demographics unit was targeting 29 ancestries of interest, which is blatant discrimination, focusing and targeting specific people based on religion and national origin. And we know that there are laws that protect New Yorkers, Americans from racial and religious profiling.
Sebastian Gorka, was this worthwhile?
Absolutely. I think what's occurred yesterday on the anniversary of the Boston Marathon bombing is a politically driven attempt to undermine counterterrorism operations.
But if it didn't work...
But who said it didn't work?
Well, the police said it didn't work.
No,
the police have said that there was nothing they got through doing this kind of surveillance that they couldn't have gotten through overt means that did not penetrate these communities in a sub rosa kind of way.
The only people I've heard making that statement are people who are not members of the NYPD and don't have an intelligence community clearance. So the idea that you have to have a concrete prosecution. Let's look at the fact that 16 out of the 19 Al-Qaeda plots, big plots that have been averted since September the 11th, have targeted New York. This kind of covert unit is not simply about gathering information for prosecution. It's about feeding intelligence to prevent attacks. So whether somebody makes a statement about not making a prosecution, that's absolutely irrelevant. Good policing is about understanding your community. This isn't about targeting communities. It's about targeting people in those communities who exploit them and use them as cover. We know Al-Qaeda uses mosques. It uses cultural centers. From Richard Reed, the shoe bomber, to Anwar al-Awlaki, the head of Al-Qaeda in Yemen, these individuals have always used the cover of community institutions to plot their attacks. To deny this is absurdity.
Linda Sarsour, I'll come back to you. Jami Floyd, doesn't there have to be some sort of probable cause for this not to be profiling?
No, probable cause comes into play when you make an arrest. The police and law enforcement community, whether it be local, state, or federal, can do this kind of investigation legally without probable cause and even without reasonable suspicion. There's an interesting tension here that each of your guests raises between liberty on the one hand and security on the other. And it is true that this led to no leads, but it is also true that we really don't know, because this was a secret program, what it may have led to behind the scenes. It is true that the police said it led to no leads, but there's always that dubious question, what might have happened had this program not been in place? This is the same argument that we've always heard from presidential administrations, from Bush to Obama. Well, we've not had any terrorist attacks since 9/11 because of our stepped up post-Patriot Act security. That's the question for the American people. How much liberty do we want to give up in the name of security? And that includes in our religious places of worship like mosques.
But Jami, wouldn't we have known if evidence had been developed through this method of investigation, through trials, through evidence being introduced,
Yes.
through police sources testifying in open court, that these were pieces
Yes.
of evidence that they generated using these investigative methods?
Absolutely, had they led to a prosecution, but we can't prove the negative, the things that may have led to investigations that we know nothing about. And that's, of course, what one of your guests is pointing out, your think tank guest, that we simply don't know. You know, it's that dubious argument. We don't know what would have been but for this investigations unit. So it becomes a very theoretical discussion about our constitutional rights rather than a concrete argument about what was and was not proven because of this investigations unit.
Linda,
this demographics unit, by the way, Ray, what it was originally called before the public relations backlash that came out of it.
Linda, you were trying to jump in a moment ago.
I wanted to say that this program was looking for a needle in a haystack, and if we want to talk about safety, we need to talk about the partnership between the American Muslim community and law enforcement. What this program did is it alienated and targeted the Muslim community, and if the New York Police Department wants leads and wants to be tipped off, they need to build these relationships and build meaningful trust with the community. This program was being monitoring 800,000 Muslims in New York City, and let's look at the recent Kansas shooting. We had a man who was a white supremacist with violent extremism, who we knew about, who we knew had this violent rhetoric. And here we are sitting here, 3 people dead because we didn't follow those leads. Did we infiltrate his church? Did we go to the bars that he drank at? This is the kind of double standard when we talk about counterterrorism, that terrorism in this country equals Muslims, it equals Islam. And that's what we're trying to say. Let's follow the leads. Let's go into where there's criminal suspicious activity. We also missed it on the Boston bombings. We had information that was sent to us from Russia about these brothers and the mother. Did we follow those leads? This is the kind of law enforcement, effective law enforcement. When there are leads, you follow them. Right now, spying on innocent New Yorkers, spying on students in Islamic schools, on Muslim students on campuses, business owners, worshipers at mosque is not the way to find the bad guys.
Jami, I know you're dying to get in. Hold that thought. We have to take a break right now. When we return, we'll talk about whether there were other ways, other tools that could have been used to gain some of the same information that was gained by this unit. Stay with us. This is Inside Story. Welcome back to Inside Story. I'm Ray Suarez. The New York City Police Department disbanded its Zone Assessment Unit. It was a 10-year covert operation designed to infiltrate Muslim neighborhoods and gather leads on possible terror suspects. By all accounts, it never developed leads to pursue. Jami, before we move on with the conversation, you were trying to jump in and respond to Linda. Could you do that quickly?
Well, yeah, I just wanted to be clear, and I'm sure this is not what Linda intended to suggest, but when we talk about these other cases like Boston bombing and the recent shooting in Kansas, we don't want to infiltrate those communities either unless there's some reason to suspect that there may be some terrorist activities in those communities. I think it's important, Ray, that the American public understand that the Patriot Act that was passed post 9/11 is what allows law enforcement to have these expansive rights, and that is legal. That is the law. And so that is the choice the American public has made. If there's some concern that people have about what NYPD has been doing, then they need to go back and reflect on the law in this country. And it's not just local police, Ray. It is state and federal police that have this expanded right to look into not just what you're doing in your mosques and in your financial records, but in most areas of your private life, wiretapping, etc. And we can talk more about that if you like.
Sebastian Gorka, in the aftermath of the September 11th, 2001 attacks, we threw every tool in the shed at this problem of homegrown terrorism. And in some places, agents of the United States government and local law enforcement approached congregational leaders and told them what they were doing. We want to know what's going on in this community. Is there anything you know? Try to develop them as sources, and in some very similar cases in other places in the country, they instead went in quietly, didn't announce their presence, and became, in effect, spies on congregations. The community reacted very negatively to one method and very positively to the other, but the information generated isn't that different, is it?
It's not a binary question. It's not either or. You don't do just, NYPD soccer leagues or undercover work. Good law enforcement and intelligence gathering does both. If you're trying to break up the mafia, you don't just have outreach with the Italian community. You actually infiltrate into the Cosa Nostra. Let's apply a bit of common sense.
But the Cosa Nostra are criminals.
Yes.
And having kebabs in a restaurant in Rego Park in Queens is not consorting with criminals or even trying to undercover an ongoing criminal conspiracy. It's looking for something that you don't know is there.
But the idea that one of your guests had that you're going to surveil 800,000 Muslims in New York is absurd. Not even the CIA can surveil 800,000 people. You're going into the community, into that kebab shop, to identify the suspect individuals, to see trends that are perhaps indicative of terrorist actions. Let's just apply a bit of common sense here. What was Osama bin Laden? Muslim. What is Ayman al-Zawahiri, the head of Al-Qaeda today? A Muslim. Major Nid al-Hassan, the only executor of a mass casualty attack after 9/11, the Fort Hood shooting, he was also a Muslim, or said he was. Now, do these individuals, do we think they hang out in Hindu ashrams or Catholic community centers? No, they hang out in mosques. Richard Reed, the shoe bomber, frequented the Finsbury Park Mosque before he was radicalized as an operative of Al-Qaeda. Are we really saying that the NYPD should be going into Jewish temples to find Muslim terrorists? I mean, really, this is beyond a joke. This is a bad SNL skit. Let's get back to common sense and allow the police to do their job, which is to understand their community through active, overt outreach, and also to penetrate those communities where there are hidden terrorist cells or maybe hidden Al-Qaeda cells.
Linda Sarsour, how do you respond to that?
I think Mr. Sebastian hasn't looked at the thousands of leaked documents that the Associated Press has access to about this program. Yes, they were spying across New York City and even into places like New Jersey. They have labeled imams in our community radical and dangerous. They have mapped entire neighborhoods, businesses, cafes, grocery stores. This wasn't about following that one person. And when we talk about the foiled plots that the New York Police Department supposedly foiled, there's a lot of questions even about those plots. There was a recent case, Jose Pimentel, where the FBI was quoted in the newspaper saying, we did not engage on that case because the NYPD informant was, quote, too involved. So I would be questioning, and thank you, Ms. Floyd, for clarifying my earlier remark, that I obviously, as a Muslim from a community who's been targeted, would never propose that we infiltrate, entire Christian communities or Jewish communities. I was just trying to point out what kind of effective policing there should be. We knew that Frazier was a white supremacist and extremist and has talked about violence in the past, and we weren't trailing him and following him. And maybe if we were following those leads and following his rhetoric, we could have maybe stopped a very tragic incident from happening. So what I'm saying is follow the leads. When you suspect criminal activity, like you said, like the mafia, you already know there's criminal activities there. But innocent people worshiping in a mosque, or young school children at an Islamic school, or people like me running nonprofit organizations providing human services, we are not the targets. We are the partners in ensuring that our city is safe. So if the New York Police Department is going to operate under the assumption that we will not provide information, that we will not keep our community safe, then that should be something that should be outrageous to all people. We need to see our community as partners, just like every other community. We are partners against the fight for terror. We are not culprits in the matter, which is how a former NYPD, Ray Kelly, treated our community.
Jami Floyd, there's the letter of the law, but there's also policy. There's things you're allowed to do, and you might not want to do them in every case because they do as much harm as good as far as cultivating sources. Steer us through those rocks here. I mean, it's understandable, isn't it, that the police went into these communities in the way they did in the months and the years after the 9/11 attacks?
Well, it's the role of courts to marry good law and good policy. And in fact, in law school, we take courses on law and public policy. And often, Ray, they don't line up. And that's where the courts, especially the U.S. Supreme Court, is supposed to step in. Linda mentioned education. The U.S. Supreme Court has actually said that students cannot sue the universities. Muslim students in particular cannot sue their universities for having been spied on in the university setting by law enforcement post 9/11. And in fact, it's a very delicate question about what law enforcement policy should be as opposed to what makes good law. Now, you're asking a very difficult question because NYPD has clearly decided a decade later that this policy does not make good sense for all of the reasons Linda is suggesting and all of the reasons that our other guest, Sebastian, says are exact nonsense. And we've had diametrically opposed policies from the Kelly regime, our old police commissioner, now to the Bratton regime. But the interesting thing, Ray, is that there's nothing legally that has changed. No court came in and said that the law has been violated by this police policy. In fact, there have been, as you pointed out, 2 lawsuits filed, but a federal judge in New Jersey, in one of those cases, said that the case was ruled in favor, essentially, of the police department. That's on appeal, but this is not about the law, what has happened here. This is about public policy, a new police commissioner and a new mayor, essentially, saying that this has not worked as a matter of public policy. Legally, the law supports this, and if people don't like it, they need to change the law.
Jami, it's interesting, in that court case that you cite, the federal judge said he wouldn't take their argument because no harm had been done to the community by surveilling it. We're going to take a short break, and when we come back, we'll talk about what harm is being done, what harm could be done, and how to watch communities that have been the source of violent criminals in the past. This is Inside Story. Welcome back to Inside Story. I'm Ray Suarez. The terrorist strike on the United States on 9/11 forced the United States to rethink national policy toward intelligence gathering. It created the Patriot Act, the Department of Homeland Security, and a greater focus on terrorism. There's now better cooperation between federal, state, and local law enforcement. This week, New York City disbanded a police unit that infiltrated Muslim communities in search of terror suspects. It was an idea that came out of the CIA. Still with us, Linda Sarsour, Executive Director of the Arab American Association of New York, Sebastian Gorka, Professor at the Institute of World Politics, and Al Jazeera legal contributor Jami Floyd. In the little time we have left, I'd like to hear from everybody on what to do now, how to proceed, Linda Sarsour, in a way that's consistent with American values, consistent with the law, but also gives the people who are trying to investigate these plots a shot at finding people before they do this country harm, before they organize the mayhem that in many cases they've intended to commit. How do you do it?
You create meaningful changes within the New York Police Department. You create agency-wide guidelines that are followed by all those who work for the NYPD Intelligence Division. You make it clear how you open an investigation and how you collect intelligence. And you build meaningful relationships with American Muslims and see them as partners in the fight against terrorism and not as suspects. And I want to say that the impact has been grave, created paranoia in the community, created mistrust amongst the community between us and law enforcement. I mean, Muslim student associations who don't want to organize events on college campuses, imams recording their sermons. I mean, this has really touched at the very fabric of our community, and I think the NYPD, or the new NYPD, has realized that and has seen the pressure and has understood that, and this is why they're hopefully going in the right direction.
Jami Floyd, Commissioner Bratton says that that information can be gotten in other ways that don't involve spying on New York's Muslim communities. Do you think he's right?
I think he is right, and I think it is exactly what Linda is talking about, although I think Sebastian is also correct. We can't kid ourselves. These are very difficult questions. It makes you long for the clarity of the Cold War in some ways, because all of this is so murky and so terribly troubling. I would just say Americans really have to dig deep and ask themselves about this fundamental tension between liberty and security. And frankly, Ray, it starts with dialogues like this one between people who are seemingly opposed in their fundamental values, like Sebastian and Linda, but ultimately want to come together around some policies that can move us forward.
Now that, Dr. Gorka, the NYPD has repudiated this policy, what can they move to? What's still in the toolbox that allows them to do the investigative work they need to do and still protects the civil liberties of rank-and-file Muslims who are going about their business on the streets of New York?
Well, it seems as if they've limited themselves for political reasons to only overt policing, which will make New York, I guarantee it, a less safe place. We have to have common sense and get politics out of this. It is fascinating. On the anniversary of the Boston bombing, not only is this unit disbanded, but we have Peter Bergen, we have the New America Foundation declare that right-wing extremists are more dangerous than jihadists, a meme that one of your guests has also echoed. This is absurd. How many white supremacists have killed 3,000 people on one day? We had Al-Qaeda operatives in this country living where? Inside Muslim communities, going to halal butchers, going to Islamic cultural centers. To say we cannot gather information from those communities means that the NYPD will not have adequate covert sources of information to protect New York. This is
Ray, can I just
very
add a
bad.
point
No, I'm sorry, Linda Sarsour,
Yes,
we're
sorry.
just about out of time, and this is, as Jami Floyd points out, the fundamental disagreement. It'll be interesting to see how the NYPD proceeds from here. Guests, thank you all for being with us today. That brings us to the end of this edition of Inside Story. Thanks for being with us. The program may be over, but the conversation continues. We want to hear what you think about the issues on this or any day's show. Follow us on Facebook, find us on Twitter. I'm at Ray Suarez News. We'll see you next time. In Washington, I'm Ray Suarez.